My name is Andrew Stotz, and I'll be your host as we continue our journey into the teachings of Dr. W. Edwards Deming. Today, I'm continuing my discussion with Bill Bellows, who has spent 30 years helping people apply Dr. Deming's ideas to become aware of how their thinking is holding them back from their biggest opportunity. The topic for today is tools and techniques and concepts and strategies. Bills, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. And as we get into number 5, I was listening earlier to episode number 4, and I just want to start off with a clarification in addition. I shared a quote, I'd rather know a little less than to know so much that ain't so, which is the opening quote of the New Economics. Every chapter of the New Economics has a great quote, and that quote is attributed to Josh Billings, who was an author, lived in the humorist in the late 1800s. And I thought that it was attributed to Will Rogers. Will Rogers is kind of the Josh Billings of the early 1900s. And Will Rogers' quote, which is a little similar, is it isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that ain't so. So and to that end, we've been talking about black and white thinking, question number 1, shades of gray thinking, question number 2. And something I learned from Ed Baker, who's a genius, worked at Ford, followed Dr. Deming around the world, a really sweet guy. And one of the first times I met him, he said something about, having the ability to realize that the more you know something, maybe the less you know. That we're so used to thinking that I know it better and better and better. And where he was coming from, my interpretation was, there's a possibility of getting to a point of questioning your understanding, which means your understanding goes backwards. And that's where I think these quotes from Billings and Rogers are so appropriate. Are we willing to let go of dogma? I mean, that's what we were talking about last time. Zero inventory, zero variation, and that's all dogma. And what these two people are talking about is that understanding is relative. It's not absolute. And also that it can go backwards. So you could, look at what you're knowing and all of a sudden say, maybe I'm not as confident. And in fact, the other thing I'll say is I met a really cool guy who was at Deming's first seminar in the UK. He worked for Ford. And I used to meet him at this annual UK Deming forum. And at the end of the days, we'd go to the pub, and I like to hang out with him because he had so much great wisdom. And one of the things he said is that he constantly challenges his understanding, not just of Deming, but is it because he found himself really passionate, but he was questioning. He had the ability to step back and question why he thought it was so important. Am I crazy? And I said, you're not the only one who does that. But I think that's really healthy, that you can step back, read other people's stuff, but the ability to keep challenging. And I think in the world of continuous improvement, if we use that phrase, the ability to question your understanding, I think is absolutely important. So anyway, I just want to get that off first.
It made me think when I teach my finance classes at university, one of the first things I say to my students is I say, if I'm successful in this class, you'll be less confident when you leave.
Yes.
And they just can't understand that at that moment in time. But at the end of the course, they realize that, nothing's written in stone, and that, it is a shifting sands, particularly the stock market. Stock market is just as one of my guests on my podcast on investing said, the stock market is a predator. And it's just constantly evolving ways to take money from you. But the point is that if you think that you've got it licked, then it may be your time up next. And so I do. And then the other thing I was thinking about is, does knowledge go backwards, or does it just become that we have a different vantage point? And also what's the motive of learning? In the beginning, it was just to gather information. The ability to interpret that information strongly didn't come until you really start to feel better and you have more experience. But then the further you go, it's like playing a piano solo and you go far away from what you learn in the rudiments.
Well,
Does that mean the rudiments are wrong? No, you're just coming at it from a very different angle now.
let me add, and this adds to our where we're going. And I've shared my what I've learned from Dr. Deming, I met twice and never asked him a question. I learned a whole lot from Russ Acuff, who I asked a lot of questions. Dr. Taguchi, I asked a lot of questions. And one of the things I share in all my classes that I learned from Russ, and I find I use the word profound. It's a model he refers to as the DIKUW model. Others have used 4 letters. I like Russ's model, DIKUW. So what is D? Data. D is data. And what is data? Data are temperatures, pressures, sales numbers. That's data. I is information. And as Russ would say, information is what a newspaper reporter writes. It's what, where, when, how, and a car accident occurred at this time. That's information. And what's neat is what Dr. Deming said was, the dictionary is filled with information. But the K is knowledge. And Russ uses K the same way Deming uses knowledge, as in theory of knowledge, which is, what is my theory for how this thing works? If I tweak this, then this happens. So the ability to understand, causes and effects, that's knowledge. I take something apart and I understand the springs, and this turns this, and I turn it clockwise, and boom, 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 boom. That's knowledge. Understanding the you comes from stepping back. And an example I use with my students is, a number of years ago, I took apart our, washing machine because I heard the bearing, starting to hum, and I thought, well, given the experience in corporations, I can either continue to let this hum and at one point it breaks, in which case I am where I am, or I can be on top of it and get ahead of it. And that's what I decided to do. So I went online, found a couple of websites, and got great instructions, took the whole thing apart, and was able to get back together. That's taking it apart, putting it back together, looking at how all these things work together, is that I gained great knowledge. But what Russ would say is, understanding how the washing machine works doesn't tell me why it's sized for a family of 4. Russ would say, taking an automobile apart and putting it back together doesn't tell you why it's designed for 4 passengers and why the driver sits on the left. So understanding is when you look outward at the greater system. And Russ also refers to that as synthesis, as opposed to analysis is when we bore in. And he said, it was really also cool. We'll get into this. I mean, these terms will come up in this conversation later. So it works out well to throw it in now. So there's data, information, knowledge. Okay, fine. Again, understanding is we step back and say, why does the car have 4 passengers? And that's also what Russ calls synthesis, which is when we look outward at the containing system. And analysis is when we go inward. So there's analysis inward, which is where the knowledge piece comes in, stepping back. And then the W piece is wisdom, which is, what do you do with all this stuff? So I'm sitting in a staff meeting at Rocketdyne, and they're talking about the results of the latest survey, and every director in the room has got a solution on how to improve their issues, and every solution involves some awards program. And I'm listening to one person after another, and this is I I knew all these people, but I was recently assigned to this vice president. And I was all set after the 12th or 13th of them said, and I'm going to implement an award system. And I was all set to say, for the record, but I bit my tongue. And it's a good thing I did, because immediately after the meeting was the monthly awards and recognition luncheon for the vice. But I say that's the wisdom piece. The wisdom piece was I was lucky. But the wisdom piece is knowing, when do I use this knowledge and when do I just shut up?
That's truism.
Yeah, and I would say I was lucky, but still, with what we're sharing with people, it's one thing to be aware of it, but you have to pick your battles, you have to pick your opportunities, and you can't be a bull in a china shop. All right, so back to tools and techniques.
Okay, but wait. I want to go back through this just to highlight it, because I think it's a good, I teach students how to value companies, and I've been doing it for 30 years. So I would argue I'm close to the wisdom part, further away from the data part. But when I bring students in the class, the first thing they do is, hey, I got data, I got these charts, look at this. But then I say, okay, so what, tell me more. And then then they get into the information. Okay, what, when, how, where, but they still don't have an interpretation of what this means. And then we get to knowledge, where they start to ask more questions. Okay, how does this all work together? And then as you get better and better in what you're doing, you get an understanding of how it all works together. You're not just valuing one stock. You're looking at that stock relative to the overall market. And then when you get to wisdom in the valuation and in the finance world, you've now seen many different parts of this overall system. And when you come back and look at the idea of how am I valuing this particular stock, so many more elements come into that decision. What's the Fed doing? What's happening in that country? What's happening in demand? If it's a car company, like I've just valued Toyota, what's happening? And we going into recession? Has that been put into is that already in the price? So data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom. All right, great. Let's continue.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And then again, we'll see where it shows up. So first I want to talk about tools and techniques. And when I present in my classes, I say there's tools and techniques, and then there's concepts and strategies. So what are tools? Tools are the implements that we use to complete tasks. So in the backyard, I've got an axe, I've got a hammer, screwdrivers, pliers. Those are tools. So is my cell phone. It's a tool. The computer, the cameras, these are tools. The microphone, these are tools. Techniques are the methods of how they're to be employed. So when I get ready for the podcast, I turn off anything that would just come on board and distract us, things like that. Close the door. So the techniques is what is the method by which I use the axe, use the screwdriver? Okay. Now we get to concepts and strategies. So concepts represent abstract ideas, such as the theory of profound system of profound knowledge, as well as fundamental building blocks of thoughts and beliefs. So those are concepts. Again, concepts represent abstract ideas as well as fundamental building blocks of thoughts and beliefs. All right. So I couple that with strategies. Strategies represent a plan of action or a policy designed to achieve a major overall aim guided by a concept. So if I want to implement Lean, implement Six Sigma. So Six Sigma and Lean are concepts. And then we have a strategy to implement, training people, whatever. And I throw those out because what I find is, well, let me even back up in terms of another model I want to share with our audience. And I'm aware that there are people listening to this if they're joining online on the Deming Institute webpage. And then for our viewers that are watching us, Andrew, through Deming Next, then they can see us. They have a video. Yeah. But I want to, as much as we can, not rely on PowerPoint slides that the listeners can't listen to. So I want people to imagine imagine an input-output diagram, a rectangle where you've got inputs coming in one side. And what are the inputs? The raw materials used to create something. It could be, literally materials or information or students as inputs into an education system. And then the output is whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So the left-hand side is the inputs coming in, the outputs are going out the right-hand side. Well, what I also think about is imagine coming down from the top are concepts and strategies, and coming up from the bottom are tools and techniques. And the idea is that the tools and techniques are used to manipulate, convert these things, these inputs through concepts and strategies into the output. And so tools and techniques offer us speed, the ability to dig the hole with a shovel as opposed to my hand, the ability to contact thousands of people in email as opposed to one at a time. Tools and techniques offer what Akoff would call efficiency, doing things well. So efficiency is about lowering cost, improving speed. So again, Akoff would talk, again, another concept from Akoff is differentiating efficiency from effectiveness. And I don't think we've talked about this in the past, but when I first heard Russ explain this, I thought, holy cow, I use the words efficient and effective interchangeably. If I was writing something, I talk about let's do it efficiently. Then over here, not to be redundant, I'd say we're going to be effective. And in Russ's work, and it is incredibly eloquent. And he says efficiency is doing things well. Effectiveness is doing the right thing. And he'd say that the better you do the wrong thing, the wronger you become. And the idea being effectiveness is asking, why are we doing this in the first place? And I say that because concepts and strategies are about effectiveness, an overall plan of action. And my concern is we get hung up on tools and techniques wanting to do things faster and cheaper. Again, what Russ would say is, the righter you do the wrong thing, the wronger you become, because we're not challenging that reducing cost of something in isolation make the whole thing worse. And we get all hung up on driving cost to zero, cycle time to zero, variation to zero, defects to zero, not understanding the greater system. So again, back to this model is the raw materials, the inputs, and come in the left-hand side. They're acted upon by tools and techniques, but the tools and techniques are guided by concepts and strategies, and that gives us the output.
Well,
go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, I was going to put it in the context that in my coffee factory, the main input is raw coffee beans.
Yeah.
And then the process is roasting and packaging. Yep. And then a finished product comes out the other end. And if I think about the tools and techniques, we use thermometers, we use roasting equipment, we use coolers, and we have techniques that we've worked on, that we have certain recipes, certain dump times. So these are the tools and techniques. And then the concepts and strategies. Well, as far as concepts are concerned, part of it is making sure that we're making the right product. Like we have a lot of competitors who come in the coffee business and they're absolute coffee lovers. And they start up little roasting factories to compete with us. But what they don't realize is that we're not roasting for the best tasting coffee. We're roasting for the best match with what the client wants from a taste and a cost perspective. And it may have nothing to do with what you and I appreciate in a nice espresso. And so when I think about the concepts, it's like really understanding where are we going with what we're doing with this. And then yes, the strategy is kind of, in some ways, I would say it's kind of the overall, how does this fit into our overall strategy of the service that we're bringing to our clients, the machines, the coffee. The coffee doesn't brew itself. It has to be brewed in equipment. So we have to optimize for that equipment. Then we have to have service technicians that train. So there's a strategy of kind of how we implement that overall thing. So I'm just trying to apply what you said about tools and techniques and concepts and strategies.
Oh, that's brilliant. And what else is cool that I've never shared with you is our One is our your undergraduate degree and our daughter's undergraduate degree are both from Cal State Long Beach.
Interesting.
And she went and studied a few changes in direction and came out with a degree in English. She wanted to be an English teacher. And then upon graduation, decided it's not what she wanted to do. But she spent 1 year in Europe and somehow got turned on to coffee. and so her senior year, she was working in these coffee shops, making lattes and espressos, and she is a coffee snob. Let me tell you, she turned me on to the difference between, you know, let's just say Starbucks coffee and Intelligentsia coffee.
Oh yeah.
And it's never been the same. And she would say, because I put cream or half and half in it. She says, Dad, she said, coffee lovers, if you have to put something in it, then you're not a coffee lover. but she worked in the coffee business and just, I mean, an incredible mind for exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And then decided to go back into education.
Yeah, whenever I go out on a dinner, since I don't drink wine and they pour me a glass of wine, I always pour in about, about a quarter of a cup of milk into my wine just to freak them out, and think, now who would ever do that with, coffee? Anyways.
But those are great examples. But the other thing I want to point out is I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, people look at Deming's work and they say, well, he uses control charts and so do the Six Sigma people. Hey, both of them talk about, design of experiments, and, both of them talk about continuous improvement. Isn't it all the same? And so when I started to explain to people, I say, don't confuse tools and techniques with concepts and strategies. And I think it's really powerful to differentiate. And I point out to people, I'm not against tools and techniques, but I shared in the past that, when I joined Rocketdyne in 1990, I got involved in problem solving, and working on things and doing training. And in hindsight, most of my focus was tools and techniques, was showing them how to go in there and apply this and apply this. And that was kind of in the community where I was being mentored by these people outside the company. That was, that's the path I was on, was, looking at, how I was being trained by the people doing the training, and that it made sense. But it wasn't until I came across Dr. Deming's work, then I said, the tools and techniques needed to be guided. And without guiding them properly, we're going to keep solving problem. So I'm not against tools and techniques. I love tools and techniques. And I spent the first couple of years and I was all about tools and techniques. And then I got enamored with concepts and strategies and say, that's where the action is. And then, but when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, you're going to need tools and techniques.
So
I mean, you may have an incredible concept, but at the end of the day, you have to bake the coffee beans.
Yep. And you and I were talking before we turned on the recorder about how I've had a little back and forth on LinkedIn with someone who posted something about KPIs. And it was all about how, and it was actually, I think it was a company that has KPI training and all that. But and
for our audience, KPIs are a key
key performance indicators.
Okay. Yep.
And it's such a common thing now. I would say almost every business has them. And the KPI concept is that, every business, every division, every individual should have some key performance indicators of whether they're doing their job right. And that is a measure that we can use to try to understand and manage people. And so I basically chimed in that KPIs, I would challenge anybody that KPIs probably cause more damage than they solve. And that's a bit offensive because, people are really relying on KPIs right now. And then one of the common comebacks to that is, but because people weren't trained in them And therefore, unless they're really carefully thought out, they don't work, or, it's harder. But what I was trying to explain is it's beyond that. You can't fairly design KPIs for individuals. And I said, and the ultimate way that you can understand this, and this is good lesson for the listeners, is just go to your employees, not your managers, who are all talking. They're having their KPI, chat rooms or whatever. But go to your employees and ask them. Just ask them a simple question: do KPIs add more? Do they add value, or do they detract from value of this business? However you word it. And I've done surveys like that, and I found that about 80% of the people have a negative perception of KPIs. And there's a lot of different reasons, but the biggest reason, that based upon what you're talking about, is that most of the people that are doing KPIs, they only understand the tools and techniques. They're not thinking about the concepts and strategies and understanding the motivations of individuals, the motivations of people to cheat, the motivations of how do you measure something? How do you know that I should be calling 5 customers in the mornings versus 15 versus 1, and have a long conversation with that one? It's nothing in the world is that objective, and you can't get there until you get to concepts and strategies.
No, what you've just said brings a number of things to mind. One is I went to meet one of the vice president at Rocketdyne once, and I have a conversation with him on a particular topic, and he was new to being the VP, and so I went in and I said, I need your help, blah 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 blah, and so we got done with that, and that went really well. He says, hey, let me ask you a question. Help me out here. He said, because at that time, at the beginning of the year, KPIs were rolled out, right? And at the highest level, the next level, and then at the end of the quarter, how are we doing? At the end of the next quarter, how are we doing? So he says, so he's a VP. He's got a dozen directors reporting to him, and he says, I've asked him to put together these goals, and they weren't called KPIs, but they were KPIs, and I forget what they were exactly called. And he says, I know they're capable of so much more. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's like, he didn't use the word sandbagging, but they were sandbagging. Yeah. He said they're kind of, underestimating, what they're capable of. He said, what do you, and he was really sincere. He was a really, really nice guy. He said, so what do you think's going on? I said, I'll tell you what's going on. I said, you're holding them individually accountable. And of course they're holding back because you expect the numbers to be met. And I said, under those circumstances, you'd be a fool to stretch. Because he says, there's so much more capability in these people, and they're holding back. And I said, they're holding back because when you hold their feet to the fire, they need a way out. So their way out is to underestimate. And then if they go beyond that, then they look good. But I said, but he was baffled that they were underestimating what they could do, because he knew these people as peers. I mean, he used to be one of them. Now he's their boss. And so again, it was a really sincere question, but he was really puzzled. And that's exactly that's part of what we're talking about.
And to come back to that, just the idea there is that majority of people actually intuitively know that they only have so much control over the situation, that they're operating within a system. And so they'd be a fool to go out and say a big number, because they can't control if the other department's doing whatever needs to be done to get to their goal. I have a friend of mine that went to work for Microsoft from a small company and went to Microsoft, and he had a big contract, multi-million-dollar contract he was trying to get in Dubai. And he asked the guy in Redmond if he'd be willing to fly out to go. He said, I'd love to go, but I got to hit my KPI to get my bonus, and I've got 2 weeks to get there. So I'm sorry, I can't. And so what was a 10 or $20 million contract in Dubai had to be let go of, because that guy just couldn't support it. He had to focus on what could have been a $300,000 KPI. So you can't think about the system when you are incentivizing people individually. And that's where...
And we'll come back to that, but I'll throw out an example. I have a neighbor who, once upon a time worked for Xerox in field service. And he was so cool because we started comparing notes. What do I do? What do you do? And all. And I never forget the one thing he said. He said there wasn't a KPI that was flowed down that they couldn't meet. and because at the end of the day, they had the ability, to play the game. And one story, a little bit different, but an example of how the game is played. There are some people years ago writing a book about companies that are incredibly creative, and this is a real story. So they went out and they came across a company where there was on average 20 suggestions per employee being submitted every week. Got to go visit this place. So they go in, and we read the reports, and they're like, yeah. So how do you do this? How do you? I mean, there's like 20 ideas per person per week. How do you do this? So the guy pulls out of his pocket a bunch of 3x5 cards. Again, this is back in the 80s or 90s. And he says, as a matter of fact, I said, yeah, I come up with an idea, I write it down, I keep it in my pocket. And on Friday, I have to, deliver 20. And the guy says, every week you deliver 20? I just like, how do you keep doing this? He says, well, like, yes and no. He said, so in my pocket, in this one here, you see this idea here? He says, yeah, well, this was Andrew's idea last week. And this one here, Joe submitted this 3 weeks ago. So I gave him a couple of mine. And so I'm going to submit 20, but they're all mine. And I thought, that's exactly what we're talking about. They're going to make the numbers. Another thing I've seen, which I don't think is not uncharacteristic, is people estimating how long something's going to take, how many hours are required, resources required, and then they end up using twice as much resources, right? And then they go back and change the estimate to the actual they used. And I was like, holy cow. And so, but what we both know is the system is causing people, as this VP, I was trying to convey to the VP, if at the end of the day you are solely held accountable as the willing worker, then you're going to go to great lengths to protect yourself by padding the budget, overestimating the resources you need and you're going to play these games because what's missing from everything is unique to the Deming philosophy, I believe, over Lean and Six Sigma, operational excellence, Six Sigma by itself, Lean by itself, is an understanding of integration and how things work as a system. Now, what I've also seen is you may find the word system used in those concepts in their deployment strategies, but that language, if you pay attention to how the focus is about question one, does something meet requirements? We want to lower the cost of this. We want to drive this cost to zero. We want to eliminate this inventory. To me, those are examples of looking at something in isolation. So even though we use the word system, you can hear the isolationist thinking. And I was I had an earache the other day, and so actually when we were on vacation, my left ear was bugging me, so I got back and waited and said, okay, I'm going to go and get a take and look at it. And so I went in to see my doctor, and she wasn't available, so I met a new guy, and so he says, what do you do? And I said, I consult and I do online classes. I have these podcasts with Andrew, and I know what it's about. And I said, well, I said, the way organizations are run, I said, they give the right wrist a goal for pulse, and they give the left wrist a different goal for pulse. So over here, I want, 45 beats per minute. And over here, this is what I want. and that's this KPI stuff. And there's not an understanding that as soon as you assign the goal to the right wrist, you've constrained everything else. And that's the concept behind Deming's work, that I so love, that with his work, I understand the fallacy of assigning these things over here, over here. We want to see zero inventory. We want to see this. We want to see this. We want to see this. And you can't, it doesn't work because they're all connected.
Well, I was thinking about, I used to have a sauna and a cold plunge pool place near my house here in Bangkok. And I would love to go into the sauna and get really hot. Then it had a hot bath. So I'd get super hot. And then I would get out of that and I'd go into the cold. And then you get super cold. And, you know, obviously your body's going through very different, you know, situations when you're in there. But then, you know, being the analyst, I started asking myself, I wonder what would happen if I put my right foot down here into the hot, extremely hot water. Okay, what signal is that sending up to my brain? And I put my left foot in the extremely cold water. And you could just imagine what your body and your brain is trying to figure out how to react to that. And that's what you're saying about the pulse on one hand versus the other. I
Yes.
feel like I want to wrap this up because we've gone through so much stuff. And is there anything else that you want to talk about before I do a wrap up?
Well, let me tell you one other story.
Yep.
I was in a meeting a number of years ago at a pretty high level. I was a bystander. I happened to be invited to a pretty high level meeting, and in the room were 9 divisions. Each division, there were roughly 300 people in the room representing 9 different divisions of the company. We'll just leave it at that. And elsewhere in the company, there's others doing similar things. So I was in part of this big corporation. Then there's others working in parallel. And in the group I am, again, there's 9 presidents with their respective vice presidents and down to a director level. And again, I'm just there for whatever reason. And the objective is to improve the stock price of the corporation. And because the big consulting companies said that if you reduce return on that, if you improve return on net assets and increase cash flow, then you'll have stock prices like the golden companies. And that's where the company wanted to be. They wanted a huge stock price. So the plan is for these 9 different divisions of the company to each work on a plan to improve their return on net asset and cash flow number. Right? So we break it into parts. Each part's going to come up with a plan. So the day begins with, this is the overall concept. The strategy is you 9 at the end of the day are going to go to a conference room. You're going to outbrief tomorrow morning with your plan and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now what? So the next presentation is on this concept called big, hairy, audacious goals. And so an outside consultant comes in and don't hold back, go for gold, don't hold back. The company's stock price is dependent upon you. So again, the concept is, we're going to break it into parts. The strategy is we're going to go separate directions. This guy comes in and says, go, don't hold back. And we get to the point after that presentation, and the number one guy in the room gets up and he says, okay, everybody understand the concept, understand the strategy. You're going to go to these rooms, come back tomorrow morning with the outbrief. Okay. And 300 people are standing up and they're beginning to gather their stuff. And before they could leave the room, the number 2 guy in the room was up on stage, comes up to the microphone, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, let me get your attention. Before you leave the room, let me just emphasize, let's not suboptimize. So I shared that later that evening with my wife, and she said, what'd you do? I said, I just stood up in the back of the room and yelled, what other effect are you expecting than suboptimization? And she says, you didn't. I said, no, I just sat there and watched. That's what we're talking about, Andrew. Every division coming up with their own thing, because the belief is if they each improve, the overall improves. But the other thing I want to say is, and we'll talk about this more in the future, is the number 2 guy in the room, he knows that sub-optimization is a bad thing. So it's like if I called the guy up and I said, hey, this is Andrew Stotz? Yeah, Andrew, hey, how'd you get, who are you? I said, Andrew, I'm your best friend, and I've got a deal for you. I am selling sub-optimization. and you're like, hold on. No. All you know is that that's a bad thing. And that's what I thought is, that's dogma. We know that sub-optimization is bad, but they wouldn't know sub-optimization if they bumped into it in a brightly lit room. And so this KPI stuff is the epitome of sub-optimization. It is every department with their own pulse. And what you and I revere about Dr. Deming's work is it's a concept of looking at things as a system which challenges that. But this advice within the corporation came from McKinsey.
Of course.
So a lot of money was paid for this advice. So it's out there, it's alive and well. And so again, when we're talking about concepts and strategies, to me, they are the differentiator. Looking at Deming's idea as a concept is an incredible differentiator.
Okay, so let's wrap up. We talked about the idea that could knowledge go backwards? Like we're accumulating knowledge, and all of a sudden we start to lose. We gain a new perspective, and we start to lose confidence in what we're looking at. The second thing we talked about was DIKUW: data, information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And it's just thinking about maturing also over time as you learn and grow. We talked about tools and techniques and concepts and strategies, and the idea being that tools are the implements that we use to achieve tasks. Techniques are the methods that we're employing. And that tools and techniques are about efficiency, which is about doing things well. And that's different from effectiveness, which is doing the right thing.
Yes.
And concepts represent like the abstract ideas, the fundamental building blocks, the thoughts and beliefs to understand how these things all work together. And strategy is ultimately, where are we going and how are we getting there? And the point that you've said is what you like about Dr. Deming is that it helps you not to confuse tools and techniques from concepts and strategies. And where Dr. Deming saw something out of what seems like a very innocent tool to the average person, he saw the damage that could be done. And then what you talked about in that last example about the guy that stood up and everybody's going to go into their rooms and their departments and then work on this project. And at the end, he says, let's not sub-optimize. And the answer from the audience should have been, well, then let's sit back down in this room and figure out how we're going to all work together to get the most out of this system. Because in fact, what we know, just like Dr. Deming taught about a symphony, is that it must be parts of this symphony will be sub-optimized while another part is being optimized to get the optimum output of the system. So to think that you can drive a business 100% on all cylinders and not have an impact on the other, it's like holding up someone's pulse on both of their hands and saying, I want a low pulse rate here, and here I want a high pulse rate. It's only one beating heart of that person. Anything you would add?
No, as I would just say again, the model is we've got the raw materials coming in the left-hand side. We've got tools and techniques, which are about efficiency coming from the bottom. Coming down from the top are concepts and strategies, which is effectiveness first. Effectiveness sets the path, sets the plan with efficiency, and then we get a credible output. So that's exactly what we're talking about. Again, we're not anti-tools, anti-techniques. What we're talking about is let's put effectiveness with concepts first.
Great. And Bill, on behalf of everyone at the Deming Institute, I want to thank you again for this discussion. For listeners, remember to go to Deming.org to continue your journey. This is your host, Andrew Stotz, and I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Deming. People are entitled to joy in work.